Something came to you. Not the way a voice reaches you across a room, more like the way the body picks up a frequency before the mind has a word for it. A knowing that arrived whole, already carrying its own weight, and now you're standing in the middle of your life holding something you weren't holding 3 days ago. And everything in you wants to tell someone. That's the tension I want to sit inside of with you, not the fear of speaking. Not the old superstitions around keeping secrets, but what actually happens mechanically, structurally, in the first 72 hours after something like this lands. Because what you're carrying right now isn't an idea, it isn't a plan you made, it's something that entered at full strength, and it's still in a state so delicate that the ordinary rules of conversation don't really apply to it. Here's what I keep coming back to after roughly 20 years of studying the languages people use to describe things that resist language. When a genuine shift in consciousness arrives, when a timeline redirect happens and you feel it before you can explain it, something ungrounded enters you. It's a high-voltage wave of information. It hasn't become anything physical yet. Not wealth, not healing, not anything you can point to. Those things are still downstream. What you're holding is the code before it hardens. The blueprint before it becomes a building, and that code needs something from you. The old traditions called it coherence consolidation. I've sat with indigenous knowledge keepers who'd never heard that term and described the exact same thing in different words, because this isn't a cultural idea, it's a structural one. Before an energetic wave can become anything you can touch, it has to consolidate. It has to move from potential into matter. And that transition doesn't happen overnight. It happens inside a specific window, one the esoteric traditions marked with real precision. 72 hours. Set aside any unease you have with precise timing. There's nothing superstitious about a curing period. Think of the human bioenergetic system as an enclosed pressure chamber. When a high-voltage blueprint enters that chamber, the pressure has to rise, stabilize, and lock. If you open the chamber too early, the pressure escapes. What was fragile potential collapses back into itself. The blueprint doesn't die exactly, it returns to wherever it was before it found you. And you're left holding the memory of something you can no longer re-enter. That's why the traditions that understood this didn't treat silence as a virtue. They treated it as a mechanism. In the monastic and alchemical lineages of the West, there was a practice called the Silentium Magnum, the Great Silence. After any major initiatory rite, 3 consecutive days of absolute verbal and social containment were enforced. Not recommended, not offered as a spiritual practice. Enforced, the way you'd enforce a quarantine around something contagious. The initiate couldn't speak of what had happened. Couldn't seek feedback, couldn't explain the shift to anyone who asked. The community already knew what the initiate couldn't yet know, that the experience was still setting, still curing. And speaking during that window acted like a pressure valve, bleeding off exactly what the transformation needed to complete. We've lost that. We've replaced it with a culture that demands announcement the moment anything moves, that treats the sharing of news as the completion of it, as if saying it out loud is what makes it real. That's the trap. Because saying it out loud doesn't make it real. Saying it out loud makes it hollow. I want to walk you through what actually happens inside that 72-hour window, because once you see the structure of it, I think the pressure you feel to speak starts shifting into a pressure to protect. The first 24 hours are what you might call the signal seal. During this phase, the subtle body begins to decouple from the ambient noise around it. The world's expectations, other people's assumptions, the frequencies you've been saturated in for years. That decoupling is what lets your internal voltage rise without immediately bleeding out into everything around you. It's why the first day after a real breakthrough often feels strange. Unmoored, that's not instability. That's the system clearing space for something new to charge. Then, from hour 24 to 48, something else happens. The part of the brain that runs constant background chatter, the self-assessment, the doubt, the comparison, goes quiet. Genuinely quiet. And in that quiet, the subconscious does its work. It dissolves what's no longer needed. Old neural pathways that were built for a life you're leaving. That dissolution is why this phase can feel disorienting, even a little frightening. You're not losing your mind, you're losing the architecture of the old one. And then, from hour 48 to 72, the structure locks. The wave moves from the energetic into the physical nervous system. It stops being potential and starts being load-bearing. The blueprint converts into something irreversible. What was a transmission becomes a spine. So here's the question I want to leave with you for a moment, not to answer, just to hold. What happens to that entire process the moment you open your mouth and hand the blueprint to someone whose field was never part of the transmission? Not what happens to your reputation, not whether they believe you. What happens to the structure, the one that was mid-cure? The one that needed the chamber sealed? Does the wave hold its integrity inside someone else's reaction, inside their doubt, their excitement, their need to respond, or does it do what ungrounded frequencies tend to do when they meet a field that can't hold them? I know what the old traditions believed. I know what the indigenous knowledge frameworks I spent 4 years working with at the University of Edinburgh said about it. And they all reached for the same image. A seed. Not as metaphor. As structural fact, a seed doesn't germinate in open air. It needs enclosure. It needs the darkness of the ground. It needs a specific amount of time before the first green thing can break the surface, before it's strong enough to survive the very light it's growing toward. You're holding a seed right now, and the next 3 days are the ground. You felt it, though. Haven't you? That specific deflation that follows the announcement. The room nods, someone says that's amazing, and for a fraction of a second you feel lighter. Then the weight comes back, heavier than before, because something essential was siphoned off in that exchange. That's not social anxiety. That's physics operating on a mechanism you carry but were never taught to guard. When you speak, the throat center releases stored kinetic potential to vibrate physical reality. The old traditions named this center Vishuddha. They mapped it with precision because they understood what we've since forgotten. Speech is an expenditure. Every word is a withdrawal from the reserve. The throat isn't merely a passage, it is the gate between internal pressure and the external field, and once that gate opens, the direction of flow cannot be reversed in the moment. This isn't metaphor. It's a mechanical fact about how energy moves through a human body. You cannot speak and keep the pressure. The two operations are mutually exclusive. Premature speech causes an immediate drop in internal energetic pressure. The vital tension required to drive physical execution gets siphoned off into the spoken word, and this is where the illusion takes hold. The moment the words leave you, your mind registers that the thing has been done, named, witnessed, acknowledged. The internal accounting is fooled. The creative tension that would have driven you to build, to execute, to bring the vision into dense physical form has been spent on sound. The physical reality remains hollow, but your mind believes the work is complete. This is why so many brilliant ideas die in the week after they are announced. The architect feels the satisfaction of a finished structure while standing on an empty foundation. The relief is counterfeit. The blueprint never hardened. There's another layer to this, one that's rarely spoken of, and it concerns what happens in the other person's field when you hand them your unanchored blueprint. Their subconscious reaction introduces micro-distortions into your auric field. This isn't about malice. Most people aren't plotting against you. They're simply operating inside survival loops, subtle jealousy, conditioning they never chose. but their reaction doesn't need to be hostile to be damaging. It only needs to be uncalibrated. Their skepticism acts as an acoustic damper. The confusion in their eyes, the passive envy underneath their tone, the polite dismissal they believe is kindness, all of it lowers the resonant frequency of your blueprint. The vision that arrived at a high voltage pitch begins to sag the moment it meets a field that cannot hold that pitch. And when the pitch drops, the structure doesn't simply wait for you to speak it again. It loses its coherence. And then there's what happens beneath the surface of that conversation. Lower density fields instinctively latch onto the fresh, high-frequency energy of your announcement. They drain the reserve fuel needed for materialization. You feel this as a fog that settles after the conversation ends. A dimness. A quiet theft you can't quite name. That's not a personality flaw in you. It's an energetic transaction you initiated by handing over what was not ready to be held. In the old monastic orders, they didn't simply recommend silence. They enforced it. 3 consecutive days of absolute verbal and social containment after any major initiatory rite. They knew what you're discovering now, that the first hours after a breakthrough are the hours of maximum vulnerability. The pressure that was accumulating beneath the surface is the very force that drives form into being. Release it too soon, and the form never fully arrives. There's a specific figure that has always stayed with me from my years inside these frameworks. 1. A single premature word is enough to begin the bleed. 1 conversation, 1 moment of excitement. 1 hand reaching for the phone to tell someone who will not understand what you are carrying. Pause. I remember sitting with notes from a tradition that described what happens when the seal breaks at hour 20. The window closes. Not dramatically, not with any signal you would notice. The blueprint simply stops its descent into matter. And that's the cruelest part. You don't lose the vision. You lose the window. The conditions that made the first descent possible were specific to that moment, that state, that silence. So I'm not asking you to be secretive. I'm asking you to understand the mechanics of what you're protecting. The transmission is mid-cure. The chamber is sealed. The pressure is building. And the only question that matters right now is whether you can hold the silence long enough for the structure to set, which is why the old protocols never relied on willpower alone, but on a system of containment you haven't yet been shown. There's a difference between being quiet and being sealed. The old protocols understood that difference so precisely they built an entire operational framework around it. The zero-leak protocol isn't a suggestion to whisper less or choose your words more carefully. It's a tactical containment methodology, and its lineage, at its root, isn't mystical. It was drawn from special operations silence, from the OPSEC discipline that governs how a military unit protects a mission in the hours before it unfolds, and fused with ancient esoteric measures that guarded sacred knowledge from the uninitiated. 2 worlds, the modern and the ancient, arriving at the same conclusion. When something precious is in its most fragile state, the perimeter must be absolute. I spent 20 years studying the languages used to describe what cannot be said. And in all that time, the most practical instruction I ever found came from a discipline that has nothing to do with the spirit. Special operators don't tell their families where they're going. They don't explain the mission over dinner. They don't post anything about an operation that's about to unfold. They understand that information is a form of energy, and energy, once released, cannot be recalled. The zero-leak protocol takes that same operational logic and applies it to the most sensitive mission you will ever run. The materialization of the blueprint that is now curing inside you. This is where the protocol gets specific. It has to, because it's meant to govern the moments you can't avoid. You'll be in a room with people who ask questions. A colleague will notice something's shifted. A family member will feel it before they can name it. The Greystone social mask is the technique for exactly those moments. It's named for what it asks you to become: unremarkable, smooth, unreadable. If you're pulled into conversation at work or at home, you answer with quiet, polite neutrality. Yes. No. I'm fine. Not much. You offer no updates, no commentary, no emotional opening that invites them further in. You're not cold. You're not rude. You're simply not available, and that absence of availability is its own kind of perimeter. The mask isn't about deception. It's about preservation. Every piece of information you hold back is pressure that stays inside the chamber. Every answer that reveals nothing is a seal that holds. The information quarantine extends past conversation. It covers things you might not think of as speech. Don't discuss intuitive impressions, no matter how vivid they feel. Don't mention financial ideas that are beginning to take shape. Don't speak about shifts in your relationships or changes you sense coming. Don't discuss healing, not even with the people who have been praying for you. Not even the ones who love you most. Withhold the status reports. The quarantine is absolute because the vulnerability is absolute. And then there's the pressure itself. That tightness in your chest when you hold something back. It isn't discomfort to be relieved. It's sealed capital. Treat it the way a treasurer treats gold in a vault. You don't spend it to prove you have it. You don't take it out to feel wealthy. You let it accumulate, and the accumulation is the mechanism. The tension is the pressure the blueprint needs to set. If you give it an exit, you're not releasing stress. You're releasing the very force that was going to drive execution. Here's a way to think about it. That urge to speak isn't really about connection. The chamber wants to equalize with the environment around it. The protocol is the refusal to let it. The crowns of empires were never defended by debate. The royal seal of discretion, the Arcanum Imperiae, was how sovereign power stayed sovereign. True command never justified its directives. It never negotiated its timing with the public. It never explained its decisions to the courtyard before implementation. The seal wasn't secrecy for its own sake. It was the recognition that explanation is a form of submission. The moment a ruler explains a decision to the crowd, the ruler has handed the crowd a vote. We've been raised inside a culture that mistakes explanation for transparency and transparency for virtue. Every instinct tells you that if people understood your reasoning, they'd approve. That instinct is the residue of a life spent seeking permission you were never required to seek. So here is the operational order. You owe no apology for not answering the invitation. You owe no context for the message that took 2 days to return. You owe no explanation for the quiet. The distance you're keeping isn't a wound you've inflicted. It's a perimeter you've drawn. And the moment you explain that perimeter to someone who can't see what it protects, you've invited them to negotiate it. The explanation is the crack in the wall. Because here's what explaining actually does. When you explain yourself to someone who hasn't been calibrated to what you're building, you're making an admission. You're saying, without saying it, that you need their permission to govern your own domain. Every justification, every clarification, every carefully worded piece of context is a request for ratification from a body that was never given authority over you. The sovereign doesn't ask the courtyard to approve the foundation. The sovereign lays the foundation. Build in darkness. Let the finished structure make the announcement. The castle is presented when it stands, never while it's being poured. The unpoured foundation needs no audience. The finished turret speaks in a language no explanation can touch. Let your results speak on your behalf. Results don't argue, they simply are. And there's nothing anyone can do with a completed fact except accept it. The power was never in the announcement. It was always in the arrival. The urge to explain will rise in your throat like something that needs to come out. That urge is the last test, the loudest one, but when the finished structure stands, no one will ask why you were quiet. They'll only ask how you knew. Pause. There's a moment somewhere around the second day when you notice the silence has started working. Not because you feel stronger, though you do. Not because the urge to speak has disappeared, though it's begun to, but because your own body has started sending you signals. Things you didn't ask for, arriving without fanfare. And if you know what to look for, you'll recognize them. The first confirmation lies in the solar plexus. That place just below the ribs that has spent so much of your life in a knot. The seat of that nervous flutter you've carried through hard conversations, through sleepless nights, through the quiet hours when anxiety made its home in your abdomen. During the window, watch what happens there. Sometime after the first full day of containment, the churning begins to settle. It isn't the absence of feeling, it's a weight. A solid, calm density, as if something has been placed just below your ribs and intends to stay. Where there was nervousness, there is pressure. Where there were butterflies, there is something closer to a foundation. It's the physical sensation of the blueprint taking up residence, not as a thought floating somewhere in the mind, but as something that has begun to occupy matter. That weight is the first sign the seal is holding. The second sign runs along the spine. A quiet, continuous warmth moving up the central column of the back, from the base to the crown, like a low current passing through the body. Not heat in any uncomfortable sense. Not fever, just a steady, pervasive warmth that feels like the nervous system finally breathing out. For most of your life, that nervous system has been braced. Tanning. Treating stillness as the pause before something breaks. That is what years of running on high alert looks like when it never quite gets permission to stop. The warmth is the drop. The signal that the fight or flight circuitry has finally received the order it's been waiting for. There is no threat here. There is only the structure. And the structure doesn't need you ready for combat. It needs you still long enough to set. The third sign isn't physical, but you'll feel it as though it is. Somewhere in that second day, you'll notice the pull to reach out has simply gone quiet. The urge to text someone, post an update, let someone in on what's happening just to confirm you're still real in there. That compulsion, the one that's been running in the background for as long as you can remember, falls silent. Not because you're suppressing it. Suppression takes effort. This is different. The need has dissolved because what you're carrying no longer requires someone else's eyes on it to feel real. It's becoming real. And the part of you that used to need an audience to feel like something is being quietly, fundamentally rewired. You'll catch yourself reaching for your phone and then pausing, not because you remembered the protocol, but because there's simply nothing to say. The work is happening. And the work doesn't need witnesses. The fourth sign comes from outside you. By the 48th hour, the environment itself begins to shift. The unsolicited calls drop off. The intrusive messages stop arriving. The noise that used to fill your inbox goes quiet, not because you've blocked anyone, but because the field around you has changed. The people who used to pull on your attention, who could sense an opening and leaned into it, they've gone still. They won't know why. But something in the space around you has rearranged. It's the same principle that makes a room go quiet when someone carrying real weight walks through it. The atmosphere adjusts. Here, it's adjusting itself around the seal you're holding. The noise that used to find you can no longer locate the door. And then there's the fifth confirmation, the one you can't manufacture and can't dismiss once you've seen it. The numbers will find you. Not once, not by coincidence. Repeatedly. 333 on a clock face, on a receipt, on a license plate in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. It's not a suggestion. It's a signature. The 3-day structure setting into matter, and paired with it 777, the sealed perimeter, the signal that what you're carrying is being held against interference. If you see these sequences, you'll know what they are. They're not random, they're the confirmation that the containment is working, that the seal is intact, that what you're building in the dark is being registered by something that sees what you can't. That's what's waiting on the other side of the second day. Not a test, a report. Pause, and that report is the first thing you'll notice when you step out from the seal, because once the 72 hours are complete, once the blueprint has set and the structure has hardened, you don't burst out into noise. That's the instinct of someone who's been waiting out a storm. You're not waiting out a storm, you're completing something, and the difference between those two postures shows up in a single step. You step forward slowly. Not because you're tired, not because you're hesitating, but because the silence has become part of how you move. Your presence has settled, your posture has anchored, and the space around you will adjust to you before you've spoken a single word, because the work is already done. The announcement has already been made in the only language that holds any weight, the finished structure, the castle standing. There's an old teaching about a vertical pillar, one that connects the crown of the head to the center of the earth. It doesn't move because it's not attached to anything that moves. And when you anchor yourself along that pillar, something fundamental shifts in how you operate. You stop reacting to what's circulating at ground level, the noise to your left, the opinions to your right, the low-grade chaos of ordinary life. None of it finds purchase anymore. You're no longer responding to the environment. You're drawing from something that doesn't flinch, doesn't negotiate, doesn't check the room before it speaks. That's the lasting thing these 3 days leave behind, not a technique. A baseline you now occupy. I want to say this plainly. Strip away any dread you might be carrying into this. Strip away the suspicion that it's arbitrary or that you're being made to squirm by something that enjoys watching you struggle. That's not what's happening. What's happening is physics. When a high-energy timeline drops into your field, it exists in a delicate state. For 72 hours, it needs complete containment to set into the physical. That's all. It's precise. And it's unforgiving only the way any natural law is unforgiving. You don't argue with gravity. You don't negotiate with how long concrete takes to cure, and you don't talk a blueprint into existence while it's still setting. So seal the vault, not because the world is full of people working against you. Not because the people who love you are secretly a threat, but because you don't need external validation during an incubation. You don't need applause, you don't need anyone's advice or anyone's opinion or anyone's good wishes. What you need is for the structure to finish setting, and it will. It's setting right now, in the dark, in the quiet, in the space you've protected with your silence. True royalty presents the finished castle, never the unpoured foundation. That's really all there is to it. The window is almost done. The structure is nearly set, and when you step forward, you won't need to say a word about what happened here. Pause, they'll see it. True royalty presents the finished castle. Never the unpoured foundation. That's really all there is to it. The window is almost done. The structure is nearly set, and when you step forward, you won't need to say a word about what happened here. Pause, they'll see it.